مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. كما ناقشنا في هذا البرنامج من قبل، توجد طرق كثيرة ليكون المرء محافظا في أمريكا. هناك محافظون من الناحية المالية، ممن يعتقدون أن الأولية الأهم هي حفظ الضرائب وتقليص حجم الحكومة الفيدرالية وإنفاق أموال أقل. ويوجد محافظون من الناحية الاجتماعية، ممن يعتقدون أن الأولية الأهم هي حماية القيم التقليدية المتعلقة بالزواج والإجهاز والخصوصية وحقوق حمل السلاح. وأخيراً المحافظون من الناحية الدفاعية، ممن يعتقدون أن الأولية الأهم هي حماية أمتنا من التهديدات الخارجية وخاصة الإرهاب. بعض من المعارك الأكثر ضراوة في السياسة الأمريكية لا تدور بين الجمهوريين والديمقراطيين، وإنما بالأخرى بين هذه الأنواع المختلفة من المحافظين. فما على المرء إلا أن يقضي 5 دقائق في مشاهدة المناظرات الجمهورية، حيث يهاجم المرشحون بعضهم بقدر ما يهاجمون باراك أوباما والديمقراطيين. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن يسرني أن أرحب بالضيف يمكنه توضيح الجنون الدائر داخل حزب الجمهوري والحركة المحافظة، وهو ويليام كريستال، واحد من كبار المفكرين والكتاب المحافظين في أمريكا اليوم. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Some of the biggest political debates in America today aren't between Democrats and Republicans, they're within Republicans and more specifically within the conservative movement. What does it mean to be a conservative in 2016? Today I'm joined by a true expert on this topic, William Kristol, the editor of The Weekly Standard. Bill, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Rob.
So we're talking today, we're doing 2 discussions, one on domestic issues, one on international issues, but let's start at the core. What is the core element of what it means to be a conservative?
I mean, there have always been different strains in the American conservative movement. There's been a strong free market, pro-capitalist strain. There's been a more traditional values kind of conservatism. There's been foreign policy hawkishness, first anti-communism back before the Berlin Wall fell, and after that a strong U.S. presence in the world. And there have been debates among and between and within these strains, so it's not new to have conservative debates. I mean, in general in politics, as you know, often the fiercest debates are within movements, not between them, right? So, but I do think the recent death of Supreme Court Justice Nino Scalia does in a way crystallize what is one of the core conservative beliefs, which is constitutional government, limited government, against the kind of modern progressive view that government can and should plan everything, control everything. Friedrich Hayek, a great conservative thinker, though he didn't like the term conservative, which proves, I guess, that conservatives among themselves are always disputing. He considered himself a classical liberal, 19th century liberal, wrote a famous essay on the fatal conceit of social planning. So I think what conservatives do have in common in domestic policy is a real suspicion of a overly big, overly powerful, overly meddlesome federal government.
So let's talk a little bit about Scalia, Justice Scalia, who was a guest on this show 10 years ago. I was very proud to have him. Well, he hosted us in his chambers. It was fascinating. Why was he such a hero to conservatives?
Well, he was a great Supreme Court justice. The liberals acknowledge that, a wonderful writer and stylist and a really deep thinker about the Constitution. But when he began, he and Robert Bork, who never made it onto the Supreme Court, was blocked by the Democratic Senate, were 2 of the first thinkers in modern times to say, wait a second, the court's sort of trying to hurry constitutional law along according to the latest theories in the law schools, according to different views of what society should do. What's the legitimacy of that? The courts is just a bunch of judges. That's why we have democratically elected legislatures, to make judgments about what's suitable for the time. What courts should do is hold laws to the standard, in addition to interpreting everyday laws in conflicts between individuals or individuals in the state. They should hold laws to the standard of the Constitution. And that standard should be the original standard of the Constitution. So Scalia is called an originalist here in America, or a textualist, someone who studies the text and the meaning of the text of the Constitution and what people thought it meant at the time it was enacted or the amendments were enacted. And when Scalia began making those arguments 30, 40 years ago, it was really 2 or 3 people in law schools making those arguments. I mean, Scalia discusses this in an essay he wrote later. You know, none of the lawyers who came before the Supreme Court even often would refer to the Constitution. It was all, well, the court recently said this, and now you should say this, because this goes even further than what you said 5 years ago. And now, even among liberals, everyone understands that you begin these arguments with, well, the Constitution says this, and this is what the founders meant, and that's why this law is or isn't constitutional, or this is why it should be interpreted in this way. So he really transformed American jurisprudence in a pretty fundamental way.
But to our viewers abroad, they're hearing you say, wait a minute, in 2016, the great United States of America is supposed to be run by a document interpreted as though it's more than 200 years old? That doesn't quite add up.
Well, its government is supposed to be limited by a document that's more than 200 years old with amendments, and the courts are supposed to insist on those limits. Obviously, Congress and the president adjust to the times, and so we have this health care plan and that health care policy and this military procurement and that. But what Scalia was concerned about was that the courts, unelected judges, were legislating their own views instead of interpreting the Constitution. So that's where I think he had a huge effect. I mean, there are now many, many students and professors at law schools and other judges who followed in Scalia's footsteps. I wouldn't say it's a majority view. He dissented in some of the most famous cases in the Supreme Court. But there, too, he was very important for conservatives. For me and for especially younger conservatives, he showed courage. He showed principle. He showed that you don't have to always be in a majority. You can have a lonely dissent. There's a famous case, Morrison v. Olson. He was the only dissenter, I think it was 1989, on a matter of interpreting the separation of powers. One of Scalia's key
separation
arguments.
Separation of powers between the arms of government.
Yes, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Scalia thought that was key to preserving liberty. You can have all the rights you want in a Bill of Rights, but if you don't have power divided and people in power who can check each other, who can block each other, who can voters can look to preserve their rights, then all the lists of rights don't matter much. And so he wrote this opinion. He was the only dissenter on the independent counsel issue. Within about 10 years, everyone agreed that he had basically been right. And now that opinion, which is a dissent, just 1 against 7 in this case, one of the justices stayed out of it, 1 against 7, that dissent is taught in law schools. And I would say, actually, I ran into it recently, I was at a college. It's taught in political science classes for undergraduates at colleges as an important text about how American government should work. So I think the example of Scalia was very important for those of us who have been in the minority, who don't always agree with the current trends. And he showed a real kind of courage in standing up against those trends, but he did it in a good-natured way and in a way that really enjoyed the intellectual argument back and forth.
Right. I do remember in his interview on our show him saying a line similar to this, saying, if you want a long list of rights, take the Soviet Constitution. Right. It's brilliant, but if you want them protected, take our Constitution.
And I think he also cared a lot about federalism, about distributing power among the states, not having too powerful a central government. In that respect, Scalia was part of a group of thinkers, really, who led to a whole rethinking, I think, of what preserves liberty. And it, in some ways, was going back to older understandings, whether it's the founding fathers of America or someone like Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French thinker who came to America in the early 19th century, or other thinkers from the 18th, 19th, 20th century, who really thought a lot about how do you preserve liberty, and whose key insight was it's not enough to just say we believe in freedom of the speech or we believe in freedom of religion, that you have to have institutional structures that help check the government.
So let me pursue this theme, the question of limited government, and ask you about conservatives today. Sometimes conservatives seem quite committed to the idea of limited government, especially in terms of smaller federal regulations and lower taxes. And then sometimes you hear conservatives who seem to love the idea of big government when it comes to controlling marriage laws or George Bush's education policy brought the federal government into a traditionally local sphere of education. Well, which is it?
I think it's more limited government. There are areas where conservatives obviously don't act according to their own principles. There are other areas where it's complicated on marriage. The conservative view is generally that the judges should let the individuals, the voters of each state, decide what the definition of marriage is. Now that's consistent, I think, with a certain view of limited government. Someone's got to decide. Let it be the voters in each state. Let's not have 9 justices in the Supreme Court imposing it on the whole nation. And it can be changed by the citizens of each state. So I think conservatives generally are skeptical and have remained skeptical of a big centralized government. That doesn't mean you can't have a strong government. You know, the Federalist Papers, the great document that explained the Constitution at the beginning that Scalia and others always cite in their opinions, I think the argument, Madison says, is in favor, they're arguing in favor of limited and energetic government. So you can have limited government, but it's also energetic. It's strong in doing the things it has to do. You don't want a government that's ineffectual. You don't want a government that's bloated and can't accomplish anything. But you don't want a government that tries to do everything, because then it won't do anything well. And I think that's been a key conservative critique of President Obama and of modern sort of big governments, liberal governments, welfare state governments all around the world, in Europe as well. If you try to do everything, if you're responsible for everything, you're responsible for the price of bread, you're responsible for the price of gasoline, you're responsible for the health care, and you're responsible for housing, guess what? You're not going to do any of them well. If the government says we're going to build the roads, we're going to provide a basic safety net perhaps for every individual, we'll provide Social Security, we'll build some key hospitals for communities, but we're not going to tell every doctor how to run his own practice, then government has a chance to do a few things well.
Now, what is the difference between conservatism and libertarianism, which also advocates limited government, freedom for the individual, these things?
I'd say libertarianism is an important strand of modern American conservatism. It's more dogmatic or principled or extreme, depending on how you look at it, in saying government should do very little or almost nothing. And I think most conservatives say, no, there are reasonable things government has always done in the U.S. and in other countries like Great Britain, and should do. Libertarians might say, why is government taxing each of us to provide to older citizens Social Security, to provide everyone over 65 a certain stipend to make sure they don't starve or they have a roof over their head. Libertarians would say that's an infringement on the liberty of every individual. Conservatives would probably say, look, that's a reasonable judgment. There's no prohibition against government doing that. It works well. It doesn't intrude on liberty much. The government doesn't tell you how to spend your money when you're 65. It just wants to make sure that if you didn't have a chance to save much money when you were younger, you're not going to, and you don't have younger children who could help you and so forth, you're not going to fall into poverty. So I'd say there's a libertarian impulse in conservatism, but conservatives are more balanced probably in what they think government can and can't do.
To connect this to our political moment right now, the Libertarian candidate has done horribly in the current Republican primary. Does that say something about the larger conservative movement today?
Yeah, I think one reason the Libertarian candidate, Rand Paul, did badly is that his foreign policy was one of, and this usually goes with libertarianism at home, of leaving everyone alone around the world. I mean, don't intervene anywhere. Let everyone make up their own mind or let terrible things happen. It's not our business. And I don't think the American public, certainly not the Republican Party, was interested in that, turned out. There have been glimmers of that, but they turned out not to really want to go in that direction. Yeah, so I think that is revealing. There was a lot of talk about how everyone's going to be libertarian this time, but that turned out not to be as strong a part of the conservative movement as people thought.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about other streams in the conservative movement in America today, fiscal conservatism, defense conservatism, and what the priorities seem to be for the Republican Party voters in just a moment. My guest today is William Kristol. Bill is a prominent political commentator and editor of The Weekly Standard, one of the most influential conservative opinion magazines in America. I'm sure he would say the most influential. Before founding the Standard 21 years ago, Bill led the Project for the Republican Future, where he helped shape the strategy that produced the Republican congressional victory in '94. Previously, he served as Chief of Staff to Vice President Dan Quayle and to Secretary of Education William Bennett. So, Bill, let's move to a different strand of republicanism, of conservatism, fiscal conservatism. How important it is for conservatives to have low taxes, free markets. Where does this rank among the priorities for conservatives?
No, I think it ranks very high. I mean, we've had a big test over the last 60, 70, 80 years around the world of socialism, communism obviously, and also a kind of state control, nationalism on the one hand, and more or less free markets, more or less limited government, lower taxes, not no taxes, but lower taxes, less regulation on the other. And I don't think it's really much in dispute at this point. We've had awfully good economic results. I mean, China and India are in a way the two most obvious cases here, countries that had no tradition of free markets, that had huge governments. In the Chinese case, a dictatorial government. In the Indian case, a mostly democratic government, but huge regulations, high taxes. They liberated under the influence actually of the West, under the influence of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, under their examples. And they've had huge economic growth now for 30, 40 years. And I think that's true in other countries. And one of the tragedies of the world is a lot more people are poor than need to be poor. A lot more people don't have opportunities who should have opportunities because government has not liberated people to pursue their own self-interest within a context of a rule of law, obviously, and the government, enforcing basic rules. So, I think the free market, less regulation, lower taxes side of conservatism is very important. And I think that's a case where conservatives had a theory. They had an argument going all the way back to the great thinker Adam Smith at the end of the 18th century. But evidence, the actual results, have confirmed conservative opinions in that case pretty decisively, I think.
So again, when we connect this to contemporary American politics, what would your response be if someone were to say, well, all that's good, but it was a Democrat, Bill Clinton, who balanced the budget, and Republicans just ran up a deficit again?
Well, I'd say that was good that Bill Clinton did it under the influence of Republican Congress. It would be great if we had both parties that spent less in general and tried to balance the budget. I mean, Bush ran it up partly because when you have wars, you do have to borrow, and foreign policy and defense policy are special in terms of a nation's obligations. But no, I mean, it would be better for the country, and it's better for all countries, actually, I'd say, if they had two parties that competed in being fiscally responsible and who were willing to be judged by economic growth. And I think that's really a contribution of American conservatism, was to say, look, we can dispute forever exactly what the right distribution of income should be. We can fight about all kinds of social programs, but at the end of the day, it really matters to a country to have economic growth. I mean, you want to have more equality, fine. There are problems with economic growth, absolutely. But it really, go to India today compared to 30 years ago for all the problems that that massive country has. And, it just it's a moral achievement to have hundreds of millions of people living decent lives and not, being one paycheck away, or not just paycheck away, but being on the verge of poverty or famine. Having enough money so their kids can aspire to go to university or to make something of themselves. It's really a big achievement, and that does come from economic growth. Intellectuals tend to look down on economic growth. It's not so, it's just money. It's not as great as having wonderful art or wonderful culture, but all those, of course, depend on money too, incidentally. But it really, for average people, having a strong economy turns out to be awfully important for their well-being.
So when conservative voters look at all these different priorities, obviously, like everyone, they'd like to have it all.
Right.
But you can't have it all.
Right.
How do you prioritize?
Well, different voters do differently, and that's one of the issues in the Republican presidential race to some degree. I mean, we're a very wealthy country, so the truth is we can have a good economy. We did during the Cold War, and we can do what we should be doing around the world, I would say, and we could do what we need to be doing at home in terms of healthcare and education and highways and the like. So I don't think we have as difficult choices as smaller countries might, that have to really say, well, we can't afford to do this because we have to defend ourselves against this enemy. We're lucky to have two big oceans, on either side of us, and to just be a very wealthy and strong country. But I would say among those different areas right now, from my point of view, this is not necessarily a majority view in the Republican Party, but it's certainly my view, defense really needs to come first. We are on the edge of really not having sufficient capabilities to do our basic job of keeping minimal order around the world. We're in a situation where we could elect a good president, someone good whom I would like, and he could take over in the Oval Office and he could call in the military and say, gee, I think we should send some troops here for peacekeeping, and I think we should send an aircraft carrier there, and I think we have to be ready to do something here with North Korea. And the military guys will say to him, we can't do all that. So we're really on the edge, I think, of a dangerous situation.
Bill Kristol, thank you so much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rob.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول استراتيجية المحافظين لهزيمة داعش، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.